If you look at any other field of knowledge, say English poets or English scientists or German philosophers, it's pretty easy to get your hands on a small volume that will tell you about the life and greatest hits, so to speak, of any major thinker or writer. We're not quite there yet in the study of Tibetan Buddhism, and the Lives of the Masters series is intended to fill that niche. We believe that in addition to reading the great works of major Tibetan writers and Indian writers in translation, it's also interesting and fulfilling to read about their lives and to read about them as something more than simply the figures behind a great work. In other words, it's useful, I think it's personally fulfilling even, to see a writer like Tsongkhapa, or like Schaeffer, or like Sakyapandita, or like Kongtrul, as a well-rounded intellectual, a well-rounded creative person who had many facets to their creative efforts over the course of their career. So Lives of the Masters is a series intended to give you a snapshot of one person's creative intellectual life. These are books that will cover the major writings of any given author, their major events in their life, and the legacy that they bequeath to the Tibetan tradition, but then now also to the global, the global world in which Tibetan Buddhism thrives. So Lives of the Masters will present biographies of Tibetan figures and Indian figures. With Tibetan figures, we're blessed with a wealth of literature about them. We have biographies, we have autobiographies, we have histories that describe, sometimes in very great detail, the lives and works of major figures in the Tibetan tradition. And so one of the challenges that we put before authors of the Lives of the Masters series volumes is to work directly with primary sources to tell a story about that figure that emerges from Tibetan sources. We think this is going to be a really rich way to present something new that you might not have heard about this particular figure. With Indian masters, it's a little bit difficult. India did not have a tradition of biography, did not have a tradition of history to anywhere near the extent that Tibet did. So the challenge for authors who are writing on Atisha or Saraha is to tell the story of that human figure, that incredibly creative figure, primarily through their works, right? To reverse engineer, if you will, the life that gave rise to the incredible work of literature or religious thought or spiritual visionary literature that we know and that we love. Very often when we read about Tibetan masters or Indian masters, they can be one-dimensional. We know them as a great philosopher in the Madhyamaka or middle way tradition. We know them as a great meditator. We know them as a great poet. But oftentimes these figures were all of those and more. They were highly creative, and their interests changed and developed over the course of sometimes very long careers too. So Lives of the Masters endeavors to capture that sense of fullness, the fullness of a career, of a life of letters, if you will, within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So Kongtrul, we know, was a great writer of ritual text, a great redactor of ritual text, but he did many other things too. He was an historian, he was a philosopher, he was a poet, he was an editor, he was an executive producer, if you will, of major collections. He was, you might even go so far as to say, a publisher. And he was so many of these things, it's hard to capture the variety in a succinct fashion, the variety and the immensity of what a figure like Kongtrul did. We're trying to do that in the Lives of the Masters series.